talk. So big thank you to you that are joining our first of 4 webinars with Dr. Scott Shackelford from Indiana University. I am Sabrina Warner, Program Director at the Institute for Defense and Business. And for those of you who don't know the IDB as well, we are a research and education nonprofit that's focused on delivering high impact and short-term education and custom solutions for the military, government, and the defense sector overall. So today we have Dr. Scott Shackelford with us, who is a dear friend and a core faculty member of a lot of our IDB programs, especially for one that we have coming up in May, which has now been converted to a 2-week program online. It's focused on cybersecurity and risk management through the lens of national security. So we hope that everyone gets a chance to check that out as well. So to give you a little bit of background before we get started, I know that Scott loves this part of it, but I do want to introduce our speaker today. He is an associate professor of business law and ethics. He's also the cybersecurity program chair at Indiana University Bloomington. And he also directs the OSHA workshop as well on cybersecurity and internet governance. So Scott has a jack of all trades accolades background too. So he has a JD from Stanford University, PhD from Politics and International Studies from the University of Cambridge, as well as a master's in International Relations from the University of Cambridge. So we'd like to also highlight that he's an author of 2 books now. One is The Managing Cyber Attacks in International Law, Business and Relations in Search of Cyber Peace in 2014. And he most recently, as of this month, published a new book called Governing New Frontiers in the Information Age Towards Cyber Peace, which is what this webinar series is based on. So before we get started with the webinar, I wanted to let you know we'd like to make this an interactive session. So if you have any questions, if you could put it in the Q&A box, which is below. I believe it doesn't broadcast to the rest of the group. So as we move along, either Scott will see it or I will see it, and we'll just ask the question out loud. And to let you know, this webinar is being recorded as well. So with no further ado, Scott, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, the pleasure's all mine. Thank you so much again for the opportunity. And this is it's just such an honor and a privilege to be here with all of you this afternoon, particularly in these challenging times. In lieu of a traditional book tour, this really is wonderful. As you guys, I'm sure, can appreciate, a lot of work goes into these books. So it's great to say just a little bit about them and hopefully leave all of you at least with some questions and some good discussion points as we wrap up here. So Sabrina, thank you so much again. As you kindly mentioned, I do wear a couple different hats around the university, and I'll just briefly kind of go into a little bit more detail on those, just in case it's of interest to any folks. In particular, Sabrina nicely mentioned that I'm the program chair on cybersecurity for the Bloomington campus here at IU. And this is a pretty unique multidisciplinary collaboration that we have on offer. So this is the first ever triple school masters in cybersecurity. In this case, we combine the Kelley School of Business, the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing and Engineering, and the Maurer School of Law together to offer an integrated look at the technical, legal, and business dimensions of cybersecurity risk management. The students also have a chance to apply what they've learned through a new IU cybersecurity clinic that's focused on protecting critical infrastructure, local governments, county governments. One of our clients right now is the Indiana Secretary of State's office looking at election security. And then everybody does applied capstone projects on top of that as well. Online, hybrid options available. We also have certificates and even digital badges. So I'd be happy to talk with any folks who might be interested. You can just go to cybersecurity.iu.edu to learn more about that. And as Sabrina said, one of the upcoming initiatives that we have on offer here that I'm particularly excited about because it's in collaboration with IDB is this new executive certificate in cybersecurity risk management in the national security context. And this builds from years of efforts that we've done on the Strategic Studies Fellows program front, which was a 3-week program that really tried to introduce the future leaders of the armed forces to the multifaceted nature of cybersecurity. Now we're transitioning from a 3-week to a more targeted 2-week program, but students in this still have the opportunity to dig their teeth into what they've learned. They'll be doing an X-Force service learning project as part of this program. And it's a great opportunity to learn from a lot of different leaders, beyond, of course, just myself in the field, about all the different facets of cybersecurity and how it's playing out in geopolitics, both for U.S. national security, NATO, as well as international peace and security. So I'd encourage you to check that out as well. We'll have more information about how to sign up for that. And I am happy to answer any questions, of course, as is Sabrina, and we can point you to others at Kelly and otherwise. And then, as Sabrina also mentioned, I'm the executive director of something called the Ostrom Workshop. And this is named, who you see up there, for Lynn Ostrom and her husband, Vincent. Lynn was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics back in 2009, in part for her work on how we can do a better job at managing complex challenges, including from the bottom up, right? So she was looking at issues around sustainably managing forests, fisheries, lakes, and toward the end of her career was also looking at some big picture issues like climate change, which we'll be talking more about through this series. And one of the things we're doing at the workshop is applying some of those insights to a lot of different hot topics in cybersecurity and internet governance, like Internet of Things, critical infrastructure protection, how we can manage disinformation and make democracy harder to hack. There's a whole laundry list there. So if you're interested, I'd encourage you to follow the link to the Ostrom Workshop there. You can sign up on one of our mini listservs to get more information. We have hundreds of affiliates all around the world, and an exciting, and this is a very relevant thing coming up in just a couple of weeks here on April 17th and April 24th. On both of those Friday mornings, we're holding a virtual Cyber Peace Colloquium, which is for a new edited volume that we're putting out with Cambridge University Press, with leading scholars from all around the world. Johns Hopkins and GW and Marine Corps University, Air Force College, you name it, are contributing chapters to this. And it's going to be the first ever dedicated edited volume to unpacking what do we mean by cyber peace? What's the best we can hope for in terms of peace on the internet, and how might we be able to get there? So if you're interested in that, likewise, please do sign up or just let me know and I'll get you the information. And that's coming up on April 17th and 24th. Okay, and lastly, as Sabrina kindly mentioned, this series, this 4-part webinar series that we're launching today with our focus on the Internet of Things and protecting cybersecurity from the bottom up, that's the Governing New Frontiers in the Information Age book. This is an extension of that other book that Sabrina mentioned back in 2014, the Managing Cyber Attacks in International Law, Business and Relations. But for this book, and really the focus of the series, the goal is to look across different frontiers of international relations, starting here with cyberspace, but then continuing next week with the first ever frontier that humanity dealt with in any great depth, pun intended there, the oceans, before moving on to climate and atmospheric governance. And then finally concluding with the final frontier, space governance, right? So we'll look at collective action problems and national security challenges across each of those frontiers, which are in turn each chapters in this Governing New Frontiers book, in particular, paying particular attention to lessons from each of those frontiers that may be applied to better managing issues in cybersecurity and internet governance. So that's the goal of the Governing New Frontiers book. But I just wanted to mention as well, because of the topic that we're all dealing with right now, the Internet of Things, I do have another book coming out in a couple months called The Internet of Things, What Everyone Needs to Know. And this is meant for very much a popular audience, for anybody with really no background to speak of in this area. It's written in question and answer format, and it digs into the privacy, the security implications of the Internet of Things, looking at analogies, governance strategies, how leading cyber powers are managing these various issue areas. A whole different laundry list there. So that's coming out, Oxford University Press, in just a couple months. It got pushed back because of the global pandemic, but that's coming up soon as well. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you guys have about either of those texts. And I just saw the chat box there too. So please do let me know if you have any questions as we go through here. That's really no problem at all. And there we go. Perfect. That's really no problem at all. And we can address those as we go and at the end. The goal for our time together, especially over the course of this first session, which again is focused squarely on cyberspace and the Internet of Things, is to do what you guys see on the screen here. I don't need to read it to you. Basically, make sure that you have some added depth, some exposure to the key areas and debates within this realm of cybersecurity risk management, particularly as it pertains to IoT. We will walk through how various leading cyber powers like the EU, like China and the US are managing some of these challenges and what impact all of this is having on, again, national and international security, because there's a whole range of them. We'll be able to delve in just a little bit, kind of inch wide, mile deep. But from there, I'm happy to to suggest other ways to dig deeper, various readings, and otherwise. So just let me know if you'd like to learn more about any of the facets that we're going to be talking about over the course of our time together. Okay. So here's the context. Like I said, we'll be dealing with these books in particular, but also there's a series of articles that have been coming out recently dealing with IoT that I've been the lead author on. So whether it's smart factories that you're interested in, or maybe even looking at the impact of cybersecurity and Internet of Things regulation in different contexts like sports or healthcare. We just did one called Securing the Internet of Healthcare. Or if you're more interested in various governance frameworks like the impact of the NIST cybersecurity framework or the NIST privacy framework, just let me know. And I'd be more than happy to give you more information as well as links to these articles as well. Okay, so just for some fun, and because I can't help it, I'm an academic, right? I thought we could start by just using the chat function, if you would like to, with a very, very brief true-false quiz here to try to get a sense for kind of where we're at as a group. We'll go through each of these, and in the chat box, if you wouldn't mind, just using T for true and F for false, and let me know what you think, and we'll briefly talk through each of these before we really dig in for the next half hour or so to our core content. So for the first one up there, what do you guys think? Is it true that 90% or so of successful breaches use basic techniques like phishing, kind of social engineering? You think that's true? Any thoughts there? I see lots of T's scrolling across the screen there.
I didn't get that.
And that kind of naturally begs the question there. Is that a good thing or a bad thing, right? But you're absolutely right. So far as we can tell, and one thing to note off the bat here, guys, is we don't have a nice, robust, nationwide, to say nothing of global repository of cyber threat information, right? We don't have a comprehensive database of every cyber attack, how many people have been impacted, what amount of intellectual property was pilfered, what economic damage all that did. As a result, we're left to rely on surveys, like the surveys that these data were taken from. Those aren't created equal, so always be mindful of where you're getting your information from, because oftentimes, some of these vendors do have ulterior motives, right? I will say that this is starting to change with some new regulatory revisions like the GDPR that we'll talk about in the EU context, as well as in the US with what's going on in California, and even Ohio and Massachusetts and a few other states. So again, starting to change, but most of this is relying on survey data with some from the US Cyber Emergency Response Team. What about number 2? Is it taken us a long time to still find out about these data breaches? Thinking back to the Office of Personnel Management breach of about 5 years ago, now 6 years ago, Target. What do you guys think, true or false for number 2? I see mostly true there as well, with some false like David there. And again, you're right to there can be a bit of a difference of opinion here because it is starting to change. But on average, most organizations are still pretty reactive to this stuff, and most are only finding out about a breach after they've been told, either by a third party, maybe it's a consultant that they've hired, or maybe it's the FBI, either physically or virtually knocking on their door. So that's starting to change. Companies are starting to be more proactive, but unfortunately, it is taking quite some time still. What about number 3? We hear a lot about protecting essential services, given what's going on around the world right now, and as well as other critical infrastructure. There's a lot of these sectors, guys. There's 17 of them. What do you think? Would the majority of the U.S. economy, when you look through that list that the Department of Homeland Security curates, that we'll talk more about in just a second, when you put all that together, is the vast majority of our economy critical? What do you think about that? True or false? I see a lot of trues there still. A few falses, Ollie. Yep. And Kelly. Yeah, and if you guys haven't had a chance to take a look yet, I'll include a link here in the chat box for you to take a look at as well. But there's the vast majority of the U.S. economy, this is true, is in fact has been designated as critical infrastructure. If you want to delve into each of the sectors yourself, you are more than welcome to. Here is the full list of all 17 of them. There we go. And I'll put this up there. There we go. There we go. Okay. Healthcare alone, right? Almost 20% of the U.S. economy at this point. It's pretty remarkable. And obviously a particularly important sector to protect right now, that's critical. But as are public facilities, right, of all stripes, telecom, finance, the grid, right, water. When you start to add all those together, it quickly becomes pretty apparent about the full breadth of this critical infrastructure designation. But then the question is, if everything is critical, is anything critical? And what safeguards and policies do we need to put into place to safeguard this critical infrastructure? We haven't done the politically difficult task, for example, of ranking what's the most critical of critical infrastructure in this country, the way other countries have, right? Like China, for example, has a scale from 1 to 5, where they designate most to least critical, with the most robust cybersecurity requirements falling on the most important, that as they see it, entities, right? In a democracy, that's tougher to do, and we haven't done that heavy lifting quite yet. Number 4, what do we think about these estimates of $1 trillion or more lost to cyber criminals? Do you think that's true globally each year? And you see different ones. McKinsey, for example, came up with an estimate of $6.5 trillion being lost by 2025, which is just remarkable. I see a lot of truths there as well. And Kelly as well. Yeah, absolutely. It's not necessarily the case. And as we said, part of the problem is we don't know for sure, right? We don't know exactly how much is being lost because no one's tracking this. The Securities and Exchange Commission has suggested that publicly traded companies in the US disclose that they've been breached since 2011. But as of right now, there's no enforcement actions to require companies to do that. And as a result, plenty aren't. And those that are, like Walmart, plenty of others, do so in a really kind of ambiguous way, right? But just to put that in perspective, if it is anything like $1 to $6 trillion, that quickly dwarfs the global market in illegal drugs, which means this is the way that criminal organizations are financing their activities. And lastly, number 5 up there, cyber attacks will be a feature of 21st century conflict, but blended. What do you guys think about that? Blended, as opposed to, in other words, a pure cyber war. See lots of truths there as well. There's just a touch of dissent. Yeah. There was a debate a few years ago, guys, about whether and what cyber war will look like. So there were some competing books, for example, like Richard Clarke wrote Cyber War, whereas Tom Rid wrote Cyber War will not take place. But the consensus has slowly emerged that, yes, of course, cyber attacks will be a facet of 21st century warfare, but it's going to be part of a hybrid strategy that will be combined with kinetic forces, right? So a pure cyber war is pretty unlikely, as we'll talk more about, since we all live in glass houses and the rocks just keep getting bigger. We'll keep moving on in the interest of time here, guys. In brief, cyber attacks have been a problem for quite some time now, even though we're constantly hearing about them these days, even, I have to unfortunately say, during a global pandemic. One of the first documented cyber attacks was on November 2nd, 1988, when a Cornell grad student infected MIT's network with the first logic bomb. This guy's name was Roger Morris, and he was prosecuted under the then pretty recent Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. But don't feel too sorry for Roger. He's now a professor at MIT and a dot-com millionaire. So things did not work out too poorly for the world's first cyber attacker. Of course, what's different now is how quickly these attacks are proliferating in numbers, sophistication, and severity, and the fact that they're targeting companies and countries alike, right? Now, again, we don't have a lot of good hard data to figure out how many of these attacks are happening and what impact they're having on the global economy. So as a result, we have to look at these survey data, which, as we already said, that gets us a certain amount of the way there, but only so far, right? All of this is only getting more problematic, though, because of this rapidly expanded, hyper-connected Internet of Things. To give you a sense of what's at stake, I thought we could watch just 2 minutes of this clip here from Wired. This is a reporter named Andy Greenberg, who actually just wrote a great book called Sandworm that chronicles the history of cyber conflict over the last 15 years, with a particular focus on critical infrastructure protection. So if you're interested in this stuff and you're a fan of kind of the type of reporting that happens at Wired, I'd encourage you to take a look at his new book. So let's just take a quick look at this for 2 minutes, and then we'll talk about some of the implications and move on there.
It's not fun to have your 2-ton SUV's brakes hacked just as you're parking in front of a ditch. Okay, hold on tight. Hold on. That's what I've learned from Charlie Miller and Chris Valasek, a pair of hackers who have spent the last year developing a piece of software that can wirelessly sabotage this 2014 Jeep Cherokee. It hasn't been altered in any way. There are no devices attached to it. But like many thousands of Jeeps around the world, it can be remotely hacked over the internet through a cellular connection to its entertainment system that would allow someone to take over its steering, its transmission, and even its brakes. To demonstrate that, I'm going to act as today's crash test dummy and drive it on the highway here in St. Louis, while Charlie and Chris hijacked its digital systems from Charlie's house miles away. They wouldn't tell me what they had plans, but they assured me that it wouldn't be anything life-threatening.
Remember, Andy, no matter what happens, don't panic.
It's not the first time I've driven a car while it's being attacked by these two hackers. But in 2013, they were in the back seat, and their laptops were wired into the vehicle through a port in its dashboard. Now they're sending the same sort of attacks remotely, and I have no idea what they might do.
He's going as fast as I've seen him. Stuff.
So first we're going to turn the fan on him.
Yeah, let's turn the fan on, see if he even notices.
All right, something just turned on, all the fans and AC and stuff. I didn't do that. The trick started small. Oh my God. There's a picture of Charlie and Chris in tracksuits that just appeared on the dashboard. But as I drove down the interstate, things started getting unpleasant and very loud. Perfect. I can't turn it down.
This is such a fun video. Steve, look at it.
And now the air conditioning is blasting, the music is blasting, and I can't see anything because of the windshield wiper fluid.
Okay, do it. Do it. Kill the engine.
So we're killing the engine right now.
It says park sense. Actually can't accelerate. I stomped on the gas, but the Jeep slowed to a crawl. It says 43 miles an hour, but I'm not going that fast. I turned on my hazard lights, but I was still stuck in the right lane with no shoulder to escape onto. Guys, I'm stuck on the highway.
I don't know, I think he's panicking. He's not going to be able to hear us with that radio. It's so loud.
Guys, I need the accelerator to work again.
The accelerator will work. It won't work!
You're doomed.
Seriously, it's dangerous. I need to move.
You got to turn the car off!
Okay.
Now you should be good to go. Semi drove by.
All right, I'm going to pull over because I have PTSD.
So now that you're all, I think, officially paranoid, it's fair to say, we'll come back. So I think as that clip did a pretty good job of demonstrating, there's a lot at stake, right? And pretty quickly we move to the realm of actual physical damage and bodily integrity, and out of the realm of kind of abstract damages to cyber attacks, right? In the aftermath of this, Chrysler, as you'd imagine, got a fair amount of pressure. So they did what big car companies do when there's a problem with one of their cars, in this case, the Jeep Cherokee, right? But also any other Chrysler vehicle with Uconnect, they did a big recall, right? Now, unfortunately, a lot of these cars didn't actually come back for that software update. They're not set up like, for example, Tesla is, which can do auto, over-the-air updates. Hey, your Model S now can hover when you first wake up in the morning. How cool is that? So in other words, different manufacturers are set up really differently to take advantage of and deal with vulnerabilities in the Internet of Things, which I think this clip does a really good job at illustrating. So as if you didn't need an excuse to stay home and not get in the car, right? Now you have another one. This rapidly expanding Internet of Things, guys, is just getting out of control really quickly. There's lots of competing estimates for how big it's going to be. Nobody knows is the bottom line, right? You see estimates from, on the low end, 11, 12 billion devices, so roughly, around 2 or so for every person on the planet in the next couple years, all the way up to 50, 100 billion plus over the next decade even. The bottom line is we're in for a mind-boggling expansion in internet-connected stuff, not just devices, right? But even ourselves with various, medical devices now being connected to the internet. There's already been an incident with St. Jude pacemakers, people having to go back in for firmware updates after they've already been implanted. That's less than ideal, right? And the big question is, when you have so many vulnerabilities across so many internet-connected systems, what does that mean for our whole ecosystem? All right, and it's important to start thinking of that in these terms, which is what some companies now are doing, thinking about cybersecurity, not just as a cost center, but as a corporate social responsibility. And we'll talk more about that too. To get a sense for what this means in national security circles, here's something you might have heard of potentially. There was a really, well-intentioned DoD program to equip soldiers stationed around the world with internet-connected devices, including, smart watches, things like that. They can keep track of how well they're doing on runs, make sure they keep fit. It was kind of a readiness exercise, makes perfect sense. Unfortunately, though, what they didn't realize is that one of the devices they were encouraging all of these DoD employees to actually purchase was equipped with Strava, and that was available via the public web. All right, so you could go on and you could do what's called a heat map. So you could figure out, all right, all the people that have this app, where have they been running? And pretty quickly all around the world, we saw the contours and outlines of bases popping up, even some ships at sea, right? So again, pretty well intentioned, but pretty quickly you can see how some of this data can be used and in some cases manipulated. Already we're seeing this now with the global pandemic, right? With different tech companies able to actually trace folks who've tested positive for this virus. That was used extensively as part of, China, for example, even Taiwan and Singapore's response to this, as well as Korea. We have not seen that a U.S. government program to do that because we have different, protections here in this country. But at the same time, that those need to be offset against public health needs as well. So we'll probably see more of that debate cropping up in due course. Just really briefly, guys, the reason that this is getting so much more complicated, particularly from a geopolitical perspective, is that we haven't done a particularly good job of setting rules of the road, of setting norms for cyber conduct, right? There's been efforts underway for years now, including through something called the UN Group of Government Experts to set these norms. If you're interested, I definitely encourage you to participate in the Cyber Peace Colloquium because we'll be going through all the recent norm building efforts at the UN and otherwise. But the bottom line is we've had some success, for example, in confirming that existing international law applies to cyber conduct. But we haven't done a particularly good job of operationalizing what we mean by that, right? Like what counts, for example, as critical infrastructure? Should we say that civilian healthcare should be off targets in a conflict, right? Cyber or otherwise, just like it would be under the Geneva Convention. Those are some of the sticky questions that are coming up, even putting aside other related issues like voting infrastructure as election security. This is playing out in a big way in Ukraine, which has been a test bed for both information warfare and cyber warfare for some time. If you follow the links there, I will send around the slide deck, of course, to you guys. You can take a look too at a video of basically an operator's desktop being manipulated by hackers coming, in this case, from Russia in real time, which is not a good day. They're set up much more readily to respond to that in the Ukraine than we are in the US because of our heavy investment in smart grid check technology. They still have more manual off and on valves. And we're actually doing a whole project now looking at blockchain enabled microgrids to see how well those might be able to cope with cyber attacks. But the bottom line is with so many more players in it, not just the Russia and China of the world, but even countries with limited resources like North Korea, if they can develop cyber capabilities at that level and to use it in that case to even help fund their regime's illicit activities, anybody can that wants to, right? State or non-state. So it's a very crowded field. Historically, we tried to break apart the problem into pre-existing law and policy categories, cyber war, crime, espionage, terrorism. That only gets us so far though because of problems of overlap and attribution, among other challenges. What do you do about a state-sponsored cyber attack involving a criminal organization to conduct economic espionage, for example? So what do we do about this? So that's why we talk about it instead of classifying these problems to dealing with this from the bottom up as part of an exercise in cybersecurity risk management. As Jim Clapper says there, we're not going to get to zero on this, unfortunately, but we can better manage this, just like we do a huge array of other national security challenges. We do that through deploying the tools developed in enterprise risk management generally. The way that's operationalized is through frameworks like the NIST cybersecurity framework. Done a lot of work on this. In fact, right now we're doing a statewide, it's the first ever statewide cybersecurity survey here in Indiana, where we had surveys go out to every level of government, every realm of critical infrastructure to get a sense for how well we're doing on a number of fronts, including the impact of things like the NIST cybersecurity framework and even cyber risk insurance. So this is one of the ways that this that companies are starting to get a better feel for what reasonable cybersecurity looks like, because we don't have a regulatory approach to answering that question. We have a lot of different resources and data points, but that can be confusing, in particular for small businesses. And that stands in direct contradiction to what other countries do, like in regions like the EU, for example, with their general data protection regulation. So there's various ways to get at this problem, guys, right? One is throwing money at it. Plenty of companies are doing that. You guys see some stats up there, which is just remarkable when you get a sense for it, right? But at the same time, there's a question of how you prioritize investments. Do you put that next dollar or euro of investment in a cyber hygiene awareness raising campaign? Do you put it these days in making sure that we can securely work remotely from home, right? Do you put in an end-to-end encryption or multi-factor authentication? It's not always clear. And it's also not always clear, what is the appropriate level depending on what resources you're trying to protect, right? Valuing trade secrets and intellectual property can be really difficult. And yet, more than 85% of the value of Fortune 500 companies at this point are tied up in their intangible intellectual property. So valuing it, that can be really tough. There's been various efforts to do that. There are some professors at the University of Maryland, for example, like Larry Gordon, you see, and Marty Loeb here. They came up with a theory after crunching some data and found that, well, on average, companies should invest about 37% of whatever the projected loss would be of a worst-case scenario cyber attack in more proactive measures. Again, those estimates really vary depending on the sector and your overall level of comfort, but that's how this group at least suggested tackling the problem. So what do we mean by really managing this from the bottom up? Some of you might be familiar with something called the OSI stack. This is basically a way that network engineers kind of think through all the different levels of a network, right? All the way from the physical aspects of this, which are really important and we can't ignore, which is why supply chain cybersecurity is such a big deal right now, all the way up in this case to the top layers here, which are a bit more of our focus on what organizations can do better, what role government should play, and ultimately the international community in better managing these threats. The salient point is that there's vulnerabilities at each of these levels. Each of those require their own set of policy responses. And this is basically only put on steroids in the Internet of Things context, right? So just a few brief anecdotes here and there. When we talk about securing supply chains, particularly in the IoT context, that's very challenging just because, again, of the sheer number of devices that we're talking about. Double checking millions of lines of code for bugs is hard enough, to say nothing of the hundreds of billions of transistors in most devices, including these things, right? Which you can't really see, but it's my phone. So that old trust but verify adage is really important, but still even more sophisticated players can fall victim, right? Microsoft, for example, did a study of production lines of some of its equipment and found malware and other abnormalities in their devices before they even leave the factory. So that's a tough starting point. Your phone can be turned into a microphone even when it looks off, right? So it's really important to be mindful of that, even these days when we're living more and more of our personal and professional lives online, to not be overly reliant on these technologies and to always make sure that you can enable things like multi-factor authentication to make it as tough as possible, at least, to log on to some of these systems you want to protect. Protocols are the next level up. These are things that make sure you get to, for example, indiana.edu and not, God forbid, purdue.edu. There's something called the domain name system that's managed by the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. ICANN, you can, we all can for ICANN. This is a nonprofit corporation based out of California responsible for the global domain name system. So right there is kind of an interesting case study in private governance applied to this global resource. Because in this case, basically until 2016, the US Department of Commerce had a contract with ICANN to run the global domain name system, but that lapsed. So right now it's a nonprofit without any federal oversight to speak of that's running this. And as you'd imagine, countries around the world still don't particularly like that setup, even though ICANN has done a lot to globalize its board of directors. There's a lot to be said too on improving accountability. For example, France has recently passed a new law that basically extends products liability to Internet of Things devices. So just like it's not your fault if you buy a brand new car and as you're pulling it out of the lot, the wheel falls off, right? It's the same thing now with internet connected devices in France. You don't have to prove negligence anymore. If there's a bug, the manufacturer or the IoT service provider has to pay for it. And because of GDPR, that liability can't be outsourced. And we can talk more about that if folks are interested. So that's one thing that's being tried, obviously, that comes with some benefits, like ideally improved security, but also some significant drawbacks, right? Like a decrease in potentially innovation and the deployment of new products and services. We can all do a better job, particularly right now, again, as we live so much of our lives online here, to make sure we take cybersecurity seriously, right? So as we said, use VPNs if you're not already. Don't reuse passwords or use password managers to help, right? You could think about doing some things like investing in end-to-end encryption or insurance on top of that. If your credit report isn't already frozen, consider freezing it, right? We don't need an open credit line 99% of the time. You only need it 1%. So, hey, what about just opening it up for that 1% of the time? We did this a few weeks ago when we had to refinance or we chose to our house. And we opened up our credit reports for the day that the banks needed to run the credit check and then closed it again the next day, right? So that kind of thing can make it much less likely that you're a victim of identity theft. This gives you a sense for what supply chain security looks like and why it's such a tough problem. I chose medical devices because, you know, again, that's the world we're living in right now. But you can see all of the different aspects of this supply chain, right? From the design of integrated circuits to the input of batteries, to the assembly and the output to nothing of actually when it gets to a hospital and finally is being used by a patient, right? Each of these steps has vulnerabilities in them that are just manifold in the IoT context, right? Which is one reason that the DoD, for example, is investing so much in the CCMC initiative and some other ways to make sure that vendors are taking cybersecurity as seriously as possible. So that gets us to thinking about private sector cybersecurity kind of writ large. The bottom line here, guys, is to make sure that organizations are as proactive as possible, to build in cybersecurity best practices from the start of a new project. Don't bolt them on after the fact. There's lots of ways to do that. We talked about encryption a little bit already. Biometrics, a lot of us have, you know, phones that we can unlock with our face or our thumbprint or fingerprint. That's great. But at the end of the day, that translates that input into data, which can be pilfered. So there's a question there of whether or not, you know, that's better as opposed to just passcodes that we can update on our own without having to change, you know, our thumbprint, things like that. Investments can certainly help, as we talked about, including treating cybersecurity as a corporate social responsibility. There's lots of companies, including Eli Lilly, for example, that are including data on cybersecurity and privacy as part of their integrated sustainability reports these days. And better organization can help. Basically, don't be like Equifax, for example, right? There was a big disconnect between the chief legal officer and the chief security officer. They weren't on speaking terms, and that's one of the main reasons that those critical updates didn't happen. And as a result of that feud, basically all of our data, as in pretty much every single U.S. Adult was pilfered, right, in that case too. So there's a lot that we can do, guys. It's not all doom and gloom. All right, we have enough of that to deal with already. There's a lot that we can do to get a better handle on this problem. Some of these recommendations that you see on the screen here, this comes from an article we did a couple years ago called When Toasters Attack, and we condensed that down for some testimony to the Senate Commerce Committee a couple years ago as well. These are the top 5 recommendations that we had at the time. Basically, I'll just run through a couple highlights from them. We have these existing critical infrastructure sectors that we mentioned. We have something called an ISAC, an Information Sharing and Analysis Center, attached to each of those sectors. We argued that we need to have deeper cooperation between these ISACs, particularly for IoT devices, right? So that it's not so broad that information is getting lost in the ether there. It's also really important to develop IoT-specific frameworks and guidelines. So we suggested NIST taking the lead on that. Since then, there has been some efforts to create a NIST IoT standard. They're still kind of nascent, but they're coming along. Related to that, there's some other efforts that are being tried, including by civil society, like Consumer Reports, to develop what's called the digital standard to begin to rank different products and services in the IoT context, along with their privacy and security, right? It's also really important to ensure that the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, is doing its job in protecting consumer privacy and security in the IoT context. That might need some additional resources to make that happen. You could argue that's now more important forever, and for us to take the lead on developing new norms, both to protect critical infrastructure, including in healthcare, right? And also to define what we mean by things like cybersecurity due diligence. So again, there's different ways to come at this. This is the idea of treating it as a corporate social responsibility. This comes from a lot of work we've been doing on sustainable development and cybersecurity. We actually did a whole conference on that about 2 years ago now, which was a lot of fun, and that work continues. It's really an interesting area that's resulted in a couple of different works to note. There's one that Public Knowledge, for example, put out with Megan Stiefel. I'd encourage you guys to take a look at that. I'm happy to send it along if anybody's interested. I also did a couple of different articles like sustainable cybersecurity and on climate change and cyber attacks that we'll be talking more about in 2 weeks when we get to climate change as another new frontier with a lot of lessons to teach us. But in brief, there's lots of tools in the sustainability context that really can be useful here. The EU, for example, right now is developing some new trust marks. So these are kind of marks you put on boxes, right? When you glance at those, you see, oh, it's organic food, whatever the case may be. Those CE marks in the EU are now going to start to tell you something about the privacy and security features of different devices, right? So that's going to do a lot to help better inform at least EU consumers, and a lot of those manufacturers might just elect to do that, globally. Same thing in the UK right now with something called their Cyber Essentials Plus certificate program. A lot of other efforts, guys, in the US to get a better handle on this. I mentioned the Federal Trade Commission a moment ago. This is the Federal Trade Commission's top 10 cybersecurity best practices for businesses. And basically, by following these guidelines, the FTC isn't saying that you won't be investigated if there's a data breach, but it was, I think it's fair to say, a lot less likely that there's going to be an investigation if you do the things that we've been talking about, like building in cybersecurity from the start, compartmentalizing your data, figuring out what your crown jewels are, and building as many protections as possible around those. Don't be like Target, in other words, which allowed an HVAC vendor to have access to its 2,000 point of sale systems for some reason, right? Make sure to use multi-factors, segment your networks, right? Make sure you're using VPNs, update. Don't forget about physical records. Don't be like CVS, for example, which was just throwing out personal health information in dumpsters behind CVS stores. That's a no-no for lots of reasons, right? This stuff isn't rocket science, just computer science, right? There's a lot of other efforts that we mentioned already around cybersecurity frameworks, NIST and otherwise. This is around former President Obama called for it. 2013 came out in 2014. We just had version 1.1 in the last couple months. It's been really instrumental in defining what a reasonable cybersecurity standard of care looks like. I have a whole hour-long webinar that the Harvard Business Review did that kind of featured this. I'd be happy to send that to anybody who's interested. But the tagline is aggressive and persistent from a couple years ago, but it talks a lot about the impact of the NIST cybersecurity framework on conceptions of reasonableness and negligence. So happy to send that along to you guys. And then there's been efforts recently to legislate IoT security best practices at the congressional level. That's taken a lot of different forms over the years. Some of the more recent efforts include doing things like making sure that passwords aren't hard-coded, right? So that you can update your password when you get a new device. So it's not as easily accessible to criminals. Like criminals using Shodan, for example. And Shodan's basically a browser for the Internet of Things. Great tool for defenders, but also a great tool for attackers, right? And doing things like, making sure you can update these products, right? Because, hey, when you put it out there, a car can be around 10, 20 years. But a lot of our devices, appliances, refrigerators, for example, they can be around a long time too. Are they getting security updates? Maybe not, right? Especially if they're not set up on an automatic basis. And then there's a lot of other efforts at the state level as well, guys. We mentioned California, so I'll just briefly talk about that. California, as of January 2020, now has a reasonableness standard for IoT devices. So basically, if you make a new internet-connected device in California, it has to have reasonable cybersecurity built in. What does that mean, reasonable security? How that's being interpreted so far by the California AG is looking at resources like the Federal Trade Commission's Guide for Business there, and like the NIST cybersecurity and privacy frameworks, which are now being globalized, right? So we see here not only the US following some of these guidelines around protecting, identifying cyber attacks, but we see countries around the world developing a similar bottom-up approach to cybersecurity risk management in the IoT context. That's on the security side. On the privacy side, really the main show in town is the EU, particularly the General Data Protection Regulation you see highlighted up here. I included a link for anybody interested in a lot of the operational impacts of this. We have a new article that's coming out called "Have You Updated Your Toaster?" That's coming out in just about 9 or so months. It was just accepted from the Hastings Law Journal. And that really delves into all of these different frameworks as applied to the IoT. So again, we'll come up with a list of resources for you guys when we're wrapping up here. But you can consult that if you'd like to learn more. But you can also just do a search now for "Have you updated your toaster?" and that'll come up. But basically, there's a lot built in here that companies now are deciding, a lot of them, to comply with for their global operations. Like, for example, a 72-hour data breach notification window, right? That's now quickly become a global standard because of GDPR. This kind of gets us, as we're wrapping up here too, guys, thinking about different approaches to IoT governance that are being tried. We've talked about some of these already, but just to make sure that we hit home with them. We talked about the reasonableness standard in California. There's the language if you'd like to check it out for yourself. There's some other ideas out there too, though. So Ohio, for example, has a new safe harbor law. So basically, Ohio is saying, hey, if you experience a data breach, but you've put into place one of these kind of industry leading standards or governance frameworks, including the NIST cybersecurity framework, well, then we're going to give you a safe harbor. In other words, we're going to grant you immunity from lawsuits resulting from that breach, right? So that's a very different approach that's being tried, and not exactly a liberal bastion, right? It's Ohio, come on. So safe harbor is one idea, and there have already been some calls for a federal safe harbor law. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, for example, has been pushing for this a little bit for IoT manufacturers. So you'll expect to hear more of that at some point here. So reasonableness is another one. Disclosure, right? So another idea, a lot of states are already requiring more robust disclosure. We have 50 different, for example, state data breach notification laws with differing disclosure requirements, but we could easily mandate the SEC, right, to enforce their existing disclosure requirements on U.S. companies to start to get a better idea for the type and number of cyber attacks hitting the IoT space and otherwise. There's also the potential for different codes of conduct. So for example, GDPR already incentivizes companies to basically help spread the gospel on consumer privacy, and those companies that do and those industries that develop codes of conduct, well, that's an affirmative defense then. So that basically any fines get lessened by showing that kind of good citizenship. There's also the IoT trust marks that we mentioned already. So that's letting consumers know a little bit more about these products. Of course, that comes with challenges. How can you do a good job at communicating, the security and privacy standards of this new, oven that you're thinking about, or this new washer and dryer? We had the experience a year ago. When you looked at every leading washer and dryer, you could not find one that was not internet connected at that point, right? It's remarkable, and that's the world we're kind of quickly entering into, guys. You might even have to go so far as to pay a premium for not having some of these devices internet connected, because it's becoming so cheap so quickly. And then products liability we mentioned as well. That's another approach that's being tried with the benefits and drawbacks that we discussed. So you can kind of think about it as a bit of a spectrum out there, with some countries preferring to, so far at least, have their federal and national governments stay out of this. As we said, some US states like California and those others highlighted are doing more when it comes to IoT governance. That's a tricky situation for manufacturers to be in, because you have to start to figure out how do you comply with all of these different approaches when you were thinking about protecting this global internet connected ecosystem, right? But still, we see various, political and cultural preferences playing out, in other words, in the legal regimes for these countries. And then, guys, there's an invaluable role here to be played by international law as well. We're going to return to this theme in the other parts of this webinar as we explore other frontiers of governance. But bottom line is we have an existing patchwork of international laws that were designed to deal with a whole range of different what are called collective action challenges coming out of the frontiers, right? Those are situations where it's really tough for all of us to work together on a common problem. We're not incentivized to do that, but it's really important that we do, right? Whether it's cyber attacks, or climate change, or a global pandemic. And there's a lot of lessons that we can apply from the work, for example, that the Ostroms did called polycentric governance that we're going to get more into, that it talks about the importance of norm building, including international law that we'll be dealing more with. But we have to also be mindful of some of the drawbacks of existing international regimes, right? Very few of them, for example, have enforcement provisions outside of the trade context, right? So even if we would have at some point some grand, UN framework convention for cyberspace, the way we do for climate change, there's a really legitimate question for what impact it actually could have on the day-to-day operations of a lot of these businesses. So it's an important role, particularly in the norms front. There's a lot of lessons to be taken from these different analogies and frontiers that we're going to be exploring together. But at the same time, we got to be mindful that cyberspace is pretty unique, like we'll talk about next week when we get into the evolution of internet governance. But just briefly to give you a sense of some of the places where we're headed, the Polycentric governance framework that I mentioned has a lot of design principles built in. And here is just some of them that you guys see up there, right? So it's things like, hey, we got to have, give members of this community the chance to monitor other members. We got to have sanctions for, members that don't live up to the rules that we set. We have to have, ideally empower some of these members to help set the rules, right? And we have to have this happening at lots of different levels all at the same time. These are just some examples for where that's playing out and where it isn't across the Internet of Things. I don't want to get too much in the academic weeds here, but as far as how we think about this from an overarching perspective, this is where some of that literature comes home to roost. And ultimately, we'll be talking throughout the series, and we'll wind up here, guys, on what all this means for peace and security, international peace and security across the frontiers, in particular for cyberspace, right? There's a really interesting literature that's developed, which is why we're doing this Cyber Peace Colloquium in a few weeks with this new edited volume. But it's all pretty new. There's a lot of lessons to be learned from the successes and failures of peacekeeping operations, for example, offline, for various analogies, and efforts in the past, like what you see on the screen here, believe it or not, was from the Vatican and the World Federation of Scientists, and they tried to define cyber peace 9 years ago. And they defined it in part as a universal order of cyberspace built on a wholesale state of tranquility, which sounds lovely. Who wouldn't go for some tranquility right now, right? But the question is, knowing that unfortunately that's relatively unlikely, at least in the near term, what more can we do to make cyber attacks comparable to other business risks and national security risks that we face, right? So how can we make it a manageable problem, such as by taking a more networked and distributed approach to this networked and distributed problem? We're seeing that in cyberspace now, and we're going to see it across all the different frontiers that we're going to be exploring together over the next 3 weeks. So I know I went over just a few minutes there, so apologies for that. I wanted to make sure we had time for questions, which I see Sabrina, you just prompted there, which is wonderful. Thank you. So at this point, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you guys have about, cybersecurity generally, IoT issues in particular, where we're headed, where we see some of those parallels. Just let me know how I can help out. I know that was a lot of information pretty quickly.
Scott, while everyone's thinking of questions,
Oh yeah, no problem.
Actually, someone just popped up with one.
Yeah, no, happy to. I don't want to speak for you, Sabrina, but I think we can send these out. No, the slide deck, no problem there. Because there's a lot of links and other things embedded, which might be helpful as far as additional resources. Oh, good question, James. And no, that's a good reminder. You know what I'll do? I'll include a section on 5G at the start of the next webinar, okay, at the start of the next webinar next week, because that's a really fascinating topic. We're actually doing a whole book chapter called Internet Governance in the Digital Cold War that's coming out later this year. We just finished the last round of revisions for it. That really features the 5G debate in a lot of detail, right? So I'll briefly pull from that in my answer to your question. The short version is huge, right? So, 5G, it can be overblown, and we have 4G, we have 3G, right? What's such a big deal about 5G? It's not just the connection speed, the 2 gig plus per second connection speed that we're talking about here, right? Oh yeah, great. We can, stream Netflix while we're jogging and keeping, 20 feet apart. Wonderful, that's gonna be world changing. That's great, but it's not just that, right? What we're talking about when we talk about 5G is not only how it powers individual devices, but how it allows for this network ecosystem to grow much more quickly and much more cheaply than it can right now. Because bandwidth issues are real at this point with existing 4G technologies. When you get to 5G, it's an exponential increase. And the architecture that 5G network is built upon then really matters. It's not like we're going to be stuck with it for decades. There is going to be a 6G, right? It's already being talked about. But the countries that got there first and the companies attached to those countries are going to have a significant first mover advantage. We saw that with 4G, with US telecoms getting out in front, and as a result, the whole app smartphone economy is the result of it, right? So imagine that, again, on steroids, as considering all of these related, 5G applications. So it's not the case, for example, that I'd argue if you choose, for example, Huawei or not, it's going to automatically lead to a Eastern and Western vision of cyberspace. And we'll talk more about those different, state-centric versus more big tent multi-stakeholder approaches to cyberspace next week. But it is going to create some significant divisions, right? Because it's really difficult for countries, kind of like the position the UK is in right now, right? To deploy different 5G systems for different sectors and parts of their economy. Usually these countries, when they make that investment, are going to stick with it. We're seeing that play out in a big way in smart cities right now, right? Huawei, for example, has been using 5G and some AI applications to deploy smart cities tech across 60 cities across 60 countries now. There was a great PBS NewsHour segment on Manila, for example. We can put in the resources as well for you guys. That has a big impact, of course, not only on public safety. It can be really useful for finding criminals in those cities, but all of that information is also going back to ultimately to China, and the authorities there can have access to it. So there's also human rights implications to consider too. So 5G, it can be overhyped, but it is a really important race to pay attention to, and it is instrumental to this whole IoT debate. And then I saw there was a few other questions from, So on small businesses as well. Yeah, and it does keep changing, and it's a lot to keep track of, right? In particular, because it has been so quick. So for example, as part of this 2-week certificate program that we have on offer that this webinar series is kind of building toward, we're gonna be digging in to a lot of those cybersecurity and privacy frameworks, including a briefing on a CMC thing, because it is just a lot to keep track of, guys. I could not agree more. And it's not the case that it's dramatically different from what's come before it, but especially if you're a smaller business with limited time and resources to dedicate to this problem, it's important to have kind of the key aspects distilled down. And there's frankly a lot of snake oil being sold right now, especially about CMMC stuff, because it just hasn't really been out there for long enough to develop adequate training to manage those issues. We're dealing right now with the Crane Naval Surface Warfare Division, for example. Just looking at Ollie's question there. Yeah, no, and that's a great question as well, because there's a lot of legacy technologies, and a lot of legacy systems that we're dealing with in the healthcare context and otherwise, right? Like, unfortunately, a lot of the ventilators that we're talking about day in, day out that we need so many more of so urgently are running Windows XP. That's incredibly problematic, right? That hasn't been updated since 2014. So you're right. It's an exercise in knowing what your most vital systems are that you want to protect, making sure that at least those are as updated as you can make them, right? So make sure that they're not running outdated software, operating systems, make sure that there's, firewalls, that there's traffic flow analysis programs and otherwise built into them. And then, knowing that, all right, they're going to get into these other systems, whether it's insider threats or external actors, then you need to have defense in depth, which I'm happy to talk more about with anybody who's interested as well. Basically consider it, again, because of what's going on, as kind of an immune response. Know that you're going to get sick, right? Imagine the worst case scenario, and then put into place systems that can respond to that, kind of like our own immune systems coming up, right? By putting in these antibodies that can respond real time to these infections. And most importantly, let human operators know what's going on so that it doesn't take, 5 months if you're OPM to respond to these breaches. That's a great question too. And I have a lot of kind of shorter pieces that we've done over the years, guys, especially that have come out in the conversation, which is kind of a nonprofit academic hub for us to kind of put out more digestible versions of research that we're doing. So if you guys are interested, we can put those in resources too. Like I, for example, did like a, top 5 basically ways to avoid, cybercrime for small businesses. And there was a short essay around that. We've done a lot of stuff recently too, as you'd imagine, on the various hot topics of the day, whether it's disinformation or making democracy harder to hack generally, We're also more looking at IoT. I did a few pieces, for example, for the Christian Science Monitor around IoT in particular that I'd be happy to send around to you guys. Basically, one of them is how to fix an Internet of Broken Things. And then, yeah, Sabrina, please go ahead. Sorry, the Q&A. Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, in Indiana, that's a great question. That was actually, David, one of the questions that we had asked as part of this statewide cyber hygiene survey. We've only gotten about 500 or so responses back so far, which is pretty good actually for a cyber survey. It helps when it's coming from the AG's office, right? So I've only had a chance to look through some of those answers, but there has been some. There has been some impact. So far, most of the attention, especially from foreign nations, has been on other aspects of, at least from what I understand, Indiana's economy. In particular, I'm thinking Anthem, the Anthem breach, and healthcare in particular. Lilly's constantly, targeted by foreign nation states, including China, from what I've heard. I haven't heard as much on the telecom side, but I'm happy to look into that. And you never know. Like I said, it might be in some of those responses already. And then Van, yeah, your question about multi-factor, it's annoying, isn't it? It is annoying. Yeah, I see. Okay, I'm seeing the longer question there. Yeah, ideally, in a perfect world, we could have separate networks, for our personal and professional devices, right? Maybe a computer that you only do taxes on and it's not connected to the public internet. There's always ways in it, right? Like a flash drive. Think about Stuxnet, right? That wasn't introduced via the public internet. That was just via a flash drive or an insider. But the more layers of defense, I see the next question, that you can put on top of that, frankly, the better. So if you have, a network router at home that doesn't have a default password, or you can create separate networks for different devices, including ideally a separate password protected guest network that any of your guests would kind of log on to then as well, right? That can be really, really helpful. As we said, not even two-factor, right? We're quickly entering in the world of not duo, but, trio and on up. The more difficult you can make it, frankly, the better. And then just, be mindful of, making sure you're monitoring your accounts through, credit reporting systems, because we've all been breached at some point. We all have access to those, and those can be helpful too. And I think we're a couple minutes over already, Sabrina, unfortunately.
Oh, that was great. Right on time, Scott.
Okay, no, yeah.
So, thank you so much for joining us. And if you're interested in our follow-on panels, which Scott had mentioned, we're doing one on oceans, and then climate change, and then space, the final frontier.
I'm
Please
excited.
contact me. Please contact me, and I'll give you the login information. Each webinar is $40 to help offset some of the cost for production, as well as if you want all three of the webinars, it's $100, which we believe is quite affordable for such great content. So Scott, I'll follow up with you as well with the resources, and to let the attendees know, we'll send out the PowerPoint slide deck as well as a list of the things that Scott mentioned throughout the call. So thank you for joining us tonight, and have a good night.
Thank you all so much. Hope to see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.